So, shall we start? Okay. Kjerk will introduce Anne.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Kjerk.
Yes, thank you also for inviting me to do this. So, ok, vou falar português. Eu sei que a Anne hoje em dia já percebe algum português, não sei se é suficiente depois para receber perguntas em português, mas logo veremos.
Lentamente, perguntas, se vos fala lentamente, eu vou perceber.
Great.
Sim, também podemos perguntar em português e a Ana responde depois em português, em inglês. Sim.
Vou tentar.
Sim. Então, tenho o prazer de dizer umas breves palavras sobre a nossa conferencista de hoje, não é? Que todos agora já vimos. Portanto, a Ana Maria Fehn concluiu o seu doutoramento em 2014 na Universidade da Colónia, sob a orientação do professor Bernd Heine, que todos conhecemos dos seus estudos sobre a África, línguas africanas, gramaticalização, etc. E na sua tese documentou o Kx'a, uma língua falada no Kalahari pertencente à família Khoe-Kwadi, portanto uma língua com cliques que pertence, na verdade, a uma família que o Greenberg tipologicamente arrumou num saco, não é? No saco das línguas Khoisan, mas que hoje em dia sabemos que já não é uma família linguística no sentido genético. Portanto, este grupo foi, na verdade, dividido em diferentes famílias linguísticas. Os interesses de investigação da Ana Maria abarcam não só as línguas com cliques e a sua descrição e a sua documentação linguística, como também o contexto de contacto linguístico histórico destas línguas com línguas do grupo Bantu, no centro sudoeste africano, numa perspectiva interdisciplinar com especial relevo para a genética e a antropologia. Além disso, também temos estado a colaborar com a Anne, o geneticista Jorge Rocha, que eu vi que também está presente nesta apresentação do CBIO, num novo estudo que incide sobre línguas e genes nas sociedades crioulas no Golfo de Guiné. Portanto, já um contexto um bocadinho diferente. Atualmente, a Ana é investigadora do projeto Tracing Invisible Footsteps Towards a Endemic Model for the Spread of Khoe-Kwadi Languages and Pastoralism in Southern Africa, na Unidade de Investigação CBIO INBio, da Universidade do Porto, que fica num sítio num local muito aprazível, que é o Veirão. E talvez alguns dos presentes lembrem a Ana, porque em 2015 ela esteve na Faculdade de Letras e nos brindou com uma apresentação que na altura era Walking in Our Ancestors' Footsteps. Hoje traz-nos um título diferente, mas um tema muito relacionado também com todos os seus trabalhos nesta área, que é Tales of Clicks and Cattle, a Brief Prehistory of Southern Africa, as seen from Southern Angola and the Okavango River Basin. Ana, muito obrigado por estar conosco hoje e, como se diz em inglês, the floor is yours.
Muito obrigada e desculpa para não falar português, eu aprendo mais, eu não posso falar agora. So I'm gonna switch to English. My title was a bit ambitious, I guess, because there's not much cattle in the talk, but there will be some sheep, so I hope you will be happy with that as well. So this is basically part, as Kjerk said in his introduction, of a bigger project that also includes human genetics. And this is a project that is currently carried out by the Human Evolutionary Genetics Group at CBU INBio in Vairão, led by Jorge Rocha. And I'm also going to present some data, in particular data analyzed by our former PhD Sandra Oliveira and hopefully our future PhD Beatriz Amorim. So you're going to see a little bit about that as well. But first I want to give you some sort of introduction to the area. So in Southern Africa, we usually distinguish three pre-colonial population strata. We have, of course, the foragers. I think you probably have all heard about the Bushmen, the Bosquimanos, or the San people, the hunter-gatherers that are very prototypically linked to the Central Kalahari. Then around 2000 years ago, there was an introduction of pastoralism that is associated with people that also speak a Click language, the Khoe-Kwadi. And they, together with the Kx'a and Tu, have been grouped by Greenberg, as we have heard before, as the Khoisan languages. But we now don't believe anymore that they are related. At least we cannot show this by using the historical comparative method. But they all have phonemic click sounds. So these are the Khoisan languages. They have clicks. Then about 1,500 years ago, the Bantu people came. This is a migratory wave from Western Central Africa. And they came with iron and agriculture, including all kinds of livestock and all kinds of crops. So I will get back to these three at multiple points in this talk, so you will get a chance to memorize them, I am sure. Just to go back a bit to the Southern African Click speakers, we usually, this is a suggestion by Tom Guldemann, we divide them typologically into the non-Khwe, which are the San proper. It's the Kx'a language family and the Tu language family. These are really foragers. All of them are foragers, and they are also the son of the Central Kalahari that you can see in movies like The Gods Must Be Crazy. And this is probably the image you have in mind when you think of Southern African Bushmen. Then we have the Khoe-Kwadi, the third family of Click speakers. And they are quite interesting because they, as I have said before, are associated with the introduction of herding from Eastern Africa. So they are supposed to have come with livestock, probably just sheep, maybe cattle. We don't know that. And we have two main branches. One is the Kwadi of Angola. I will talk more about that because I have carried out some research there with Georges. And the Khwe language family, which consists of the Khoe-Kwadi, they are herders, and the Kalahari Khwe, who are also foragers and are actually quite similar to the Kx'a and Tu in their cultural habits and also in the way they look, but they speak a different language. They speak a Khoe-Kwadi language. What I call here Khoe is in older literature sometimes called Khoi or Hottentot. I mean, the Hottentot is obviously not a politically correct term. I think in Portuguese you have the word Hottentotismo for something that cannot be understood very well and probably was supposed to be an imitation of the sounds in the language of the Khoe. I'm not speaking very much about them in this talk. You should know that they are the herders of Namibia and South Africa, and Nama of Namibia are still a substantial part of the population there, and there's TV stations and radio stations where you can hear people speak Nama. So Nama is, of all the Click languages presented here, it's the most widely spoken. Most of these other languages are either or actually extinct. I have the non-Khwe, which is Kx'a and Tu, the forager, the real forager languages. And there are some typological features that are associated with that. I'm not going to go through them one by one. This is a list that was basically published by Tom Guldemann and revised by Guldemann and myself in 2017. I will get back to that list later, but this is mostly typological features. You see here, there's SVO, word, order, head independent marking, the existence of serial verb constructions. And I put this here because the important take-home message is here that Kx'a and Tu, they have all of those, and Khoe-Kwadi doesn't have them. And the thing here is that if Khoe-Kwadi also displays these typological features, we usually assume that some sort of contact must have taken place. And in the course of that contact, Khoe-Kwadi became more similar to Kx'a and Tu. I'm going to present an example of that later on that is actually quite striking. Again, to talk about a bit the difference between Khoe-Kwadi and non-Khwe is in these typological features. And here I give you an example. We have the word order. We have SVO in Khung here in this example, Mi Mashin Gu, And in the Khoe-Kwadi languages, we have usually subject, object, verb, like here in Sicha, Tiko, Tsa, Kx'a, or in Kwadi, Ta, Amala, one day. So you see here the word order is different, and as we will see later, this is quite flexible in some Khoe-Kwadi languages, probably due to contact. And another typological difference would be alignment. We have neutral alignment in non-Khwen, Kx'a, and Tu, and we have accusative alignment in the Khwe languages where the object of the clause is marked, and as you can see here in Kwadi, we even have object indexing on the word. So these languages now contact. So we have the Kx'a and Tu that are already there. They are there in the Kalahari Basin area in Southern Africa. And the Khoe-Kwadi, or the ancestor of the Khoe-Kwadi, would come from Eastern Africa. So now these two languages about 2,000 years ago enter in a contact relationship. On the surface, we have lexical borrowing. We have a lot of that. So we find a lot of lexicon from Kx'a and Tu in Khoe-Kwadi. And we also find some, though less, lexicon of Khoe-Kwadi in Kx'a and Tu. Then it's quite obvious, and I will show you that later in a nice example, that some speakers of Kx'a and Tu shifted to Khoe-Kwadi languages, and they did so with heavy substrate interference. At a later stage, not so much after the arrival of the Khoe-Kwadi, Bantu speakers arrived from two parts of the continent. And we also have lexical borrowing from Bantu. Bantu languages now borrow from Kx'a and Tu languages. They borrow from Khoe-Kwadi languages. The most known example is probably the Nguni languages of South Africa, like Xhosa and Zulu, that have really a lot of words with clicks. We also have some structural borrowing into Bantu, which is, I will show you an example for head final compounds later. And of course, there's also the phonological feature of phonemic clicks that we find in Southern Bantu and also in some Southwestern Bantu languages. And finally, in the existing Khoe-Kwadi languages, we actually find a lot of lexical borrowing from Bantu. So these languages borrow a lot of terms from Bantu. Kx'a and Tu languages less. I come to that later. Probably the main contact of Bantu speakers were the Khoe-Kwadi speakers, not so much the Kx'a and Tu speakers. Here I put you a map where you can see the distribution. You can see here that it looks a bit like the Khoe-Kwadi shove themselves into the others. We have the Kx'a in the north, the Tu in the south, and the Kwadi in Angola, the Kalahari Khwe, who are all foragers, mostly in Botswana, but also a little bit here in Zimbabwe, also a little bit in the Caprivi Strip in Namibia, and into Angola again in the southeast, the Khwe speakers. And we have the Khwe speakers, the big herders of South Africa and Namibia. So now all these languages are here in contact, and there's basically two big contact areas that have been identified and that are quite well described. There's on the one hand the central Kalahari, where we have contact between Kx'a, Tu and Khoe-Kwadi. Bantu is not participating so much here, a little bit in the Kalahari, but much less. And then we have here in the south, the Cape linguistic area, which has been described by Tom Guldemann. And this is mostly contact between Tu and Khoe-Kwadi languages, but also involves the Eastern Bantu, the borrowing of the click sounds into Nguni. Now, I want to go to an area that has not been described so much, which is mostly Southern Angola and the Okavango River Basin. I have divided this in two parts. One part is Southwestern Angola and one is the Okavango River Basin. I will present an example for language contact in each of these two areas. And these areas usually involve contact between the northern foragers, the Kx'a, Khoe-Kwadi speakers, and Bantu speakers from both the eastern and the western branch of the Bantu migrations. So I will start with the example of Southwestern Angola. I give you here the groups. We have some Khum speakers in Mupa National Park. They speak a dialect that is quite close to dialects that have been described in Namibia. Then we have Adi. They nowadays call themselves Khwepe. They have shifted to Kuvale. They speak now a Bantu language, But as we will see, there is in fact some remembrance of Kwadi there. Then we have the Kx'a and the Twa. These groups are often considered a bit mysterious because they have been described as foragers by the missionary Carlos Esterman. And he had the idea that there are some weird stratum of black pre-Bantu foragers. I'm not really going to speak much about that today, but I can tell you that probably they are mostly impoverished Bantu speakers that became peripatetic, but they are not necessarily a very old layer. Then we have the Himba. We mostly find them in Angola in Iona National Park, and they are very traditional there. So this is a picture that was taken there on a normal day. This is not a touristy setting. And then we have the Kuvale, who are a big and quite pushy pastoral group that is mostly surrounding the Khwe and the Kx'a and the Twa. I'm going to speak a bit about Kwadi now. Here you can see a settlement that is Khwe. This is where we met the Khwe and also the last speakers of Kwadi. They are quite nomadic, but in this case, they settled down on this dune because Mpeape, the chief of the group, he wanted the other people and the kids to go to school. And he was, in fact, going to school himself because he wanted to learn how to read and write. So they settled down here, a bigger settlement near Koroka. And that's where we encountered them and stayed with them for several weeks. The Kwadi have historically been linked to the introduction of livestock. They are still herders, mostly small-scale herders. They have sheep, goats, and some very few cattle. And the arrival of livestock in Southern Africa has been depicted in rock art, as you can see here. This is rock art done by the San, by the foragers, but they drew people that came with sheep that have a very fat tail, and this is the fat-tailed sheep that you also still can find in Angola. And we did some genetic analysis of these sheep, and they actually show a very, very strong link to Eastern Africa. In Southwestern Angola itself, there is a very famous rock art site you may have heard about. It's Chitunduhulu. And there we find geometric rock art. And this rock art has been associated with the herders that brought these sheep. There's a quite recent dating that suggests this rock art is quite old, but I have talked to some rock art experts, and it seems that now the consensus opinion is that this is probably Bantu rock art, but we don't really know very well. It could be that this rock art is in fact associated with these herders. So the Kwadi live in the Koroka River mouth near Tomba, which is was called Porto Alexandre. I don't know what it is called at the moment. The language was first mentioned in the 18th century. We don't really know if this is about Kwadi, but Pilato da Silva, he mentions in the area a Click language and also pastoralists who live in houses made of whale ribs. Then the travelers Capello and Ivans, they refer to a speech community that speaks with clicks. And this time we can really say it's the Kwadi because they give two words for one and two. One is Krui and the other Trena, and this is clearly Kwadi. There was a limited documentation by the South African linguist Ernst Westphal. I think his attention was drawn by Antonio de Almeida, who was there during the 1950s, and then sent Westphal some language samples, and Westphal later went there himself during the 50s and 60s, but then the language was already on the verge of disappearing. We met, however, the descendants of the people he was working with. And we also found two rememberers that were alive in 2014. So Donna Philishmin and Donna Clementine were two older ladies that learned the language from an older lady they were hanging around with when they were kids. And they could still speak reasonably well, and they actually produced sentences and utterances that were within the frame of the language recorded by Westphal. Kwadi has been shown to be a higher order relative of the Khwe languages by Tom Guldemann based on the pronoun system. And also some regular sound correspondences have been identified in Guldemann and Eldak in 2010. And in fact, from my own research, I can say that the historical comparative method holds here, and there's indeed many, many regular correspondences between the Khwe languages, which include Kalahari Khwe and Khwe and Kwadi. However, there are significant structural differences between Kwadi and the Khwe languages. If you look at the structure of the language, they don't really look very related, which made Westphal say, probably they're not related at all. And it still remains to be tackled why they are structurally so different. However, 60% of the core lexicon of Kwadi is shared with the Khwe languages. So since Kwadi is here in the Koroka River mouth and not very far from Khung speakers, we've asked ourselves, was there contact between Khung speakers and the Kwadi? And lexically, it seems so, even though we only find actually 3 items that we can place. Kx'a, which is land or soil, and in fact gives the name to the Kx'a language family. Then we have Khung, the springbok, and Khung, to kill, which probably comes from a Khung root. Khung. There may be more. We don't have a really big Kwadi lexicon available. So what we can say based on these lexemes is that speakers of our language were at some point in contact with speakers of Kwadi. If this happened where they are now, or if this happened by the moving west, we can answer. I then analyzed 113 lexical roots from core lexicon. I looked at meanings from the Leipzig Jakarta and the Swadesh 100 word list. And we find that about 60% are shared with Khwe. Then we have a chunk that is shared with Bantu, not so much. And a big, also a bigger part where we don't really know. Could be that this was in the proto-language, could be independent developments, unidentified borrowings. We cannot say much about this. But here you see the items from Bantu in the core lexicon. So we see, since we have borrowing in the core lexicon, there must have been considerable contact here. E for the egg, golo for niotai, road, root, salt, sea, and sit. So this even includes 2 verbs. I then looked a little bit at these Bantu borrowings in Kwadi, and I found that it seems that there are 2 borrowing layers. One seems to be earlier, when the Kwadi were not yet bilingual in Bantu. So they adapted their borrowings to their own language. So the Khoe-Kwadi languages, they don't have pre-nasalized clusters like Bantu has, like mb and ng. And what happens here is they simply got rid of them in the borrowing. So they adapted the borrowings to their own phonotactic template. So for example, Gombe, the cattle, was borrowed as Khwe. Kombo, the goat, was borrowed as Kobo. The kudu, Sholongo, was borrowed as Sholo, and the friend Mupanga was with the Bantu prefix borrowed as Mupa, and so forth. We also have borrowings with prenasalized clusters, but my assumption here is that they were borrowed at a later stage when the Kwadi or many Kwadi speakers were already bilingual in a Bantu language, and didn't have so many issues anymore in incorporating these sounds that now had become more familiar to them. Kwadi is also a click language. However, as I will show you now, there is not much clicking going on in Kwadi anymore. Normally in Southern African Khoisan, we have 6 clicks. 4 of them appear in all families. It's dental, it's here behind the teeth, then lateral. It's what you do to cheer on a horse. If you say palatal, you have to pull up the roof of your tongue. My mouth is a bit dry, so it doesn't work so well. And alveolar, it's this champagne cork click. It plops very loudly. Then we have 2 clicks, a retroflex click that exists in Kx'a only and that I cannot do and also will not try. And the bilabial click from that exists in 2 and in 1 Kx'a language, which is like the kissing click. It goes, but it goes inside. It's not so much, it's more, it's a lip smack if you want. So in Kwadi, we have the dental click. It is there, as you can see here. Ui is the number 1. E is a clitoris. Mu is to be small. Is a bone. Kx'a is a urine or urinate, and Kx'a is to fall. So what you can see here is that what I call here proto is the reconstruction, meaning in the proto language, based on what we know from Khoe-Kwadi and Kalahari Khoe, Proto-Khoe probably had these ways of pronouncing a click, like plain, with voicing, with nasalization, with a glottal stop, with velar or uvular friction, and with an ejective. So what we find here in Kwadi is that most clicks are now pronounced with a glottal stop accompaniment, which is actually really the easiest. When you start to learn to click, you usually make a pause after the click, and this is exactly what happens here. So, ui, eh. And this is probably due to the loss of the language that these accompaniments have been lost, and most accompaniments of have been leveled to the glottal stop. However, we have some retention here in the prenasalization. This is quite easy to pronounce, and also in the alveolar the velar friction with Kx'a. But we see here already the click inventory. The many ways to pronounce a click have already been reduced in Kwadi. The other clicks have been lost entirely. They are replaced by non-click consonants. And this is something that happens also in other Khoisan languages. Click loss is a widespread phenomenon. We don't really know what triggers it. Is it just a normal sound change? Is it the way things go? Or is this people losing their language? Is it many Bantu speakers entering the language and kind of facilitating the pronunciation, and then the facilitated pronunciation without the click spreads? Is it a mashup? Is it a mixture of all those? Probably. This is a topic we're still working on, but what you can see here, the lateral click, we have this word here, which should be the tooth, but they don't click and they say klong, which is also quite complicated to pronounce in my opinion. Then the palatal click, like a nose, and has disappeared and has become Khwe or Khwe, and our part has also become Tsao and later Tso. And the alveolar click, which has disappeared in a lot of Khoisan languages, including some Kx'a languages from Angola, Kang from Khwe and Kong from Khwe. In another set, this click has further become spiranticized. So probably what we have here is even a further development with spirantization of this stop to of this velar stop to a velar fricative, humu from Khwe. And it's actually this rather unusual sound change that we don't find anywhere else in the Khoisan languages, that has been for a long time quite difficult to actually identify cognates, because there's quite many of with this velar fricative that go back to a click. After we have seen a little bit of the Bantu influence on Kwadi, I want to show you a little bit of Kwadi influence on Bantu, if it exists. This was one of the big questions of the project. Is there a considerable influence of Kwadi on the Bantu languages of the area? But the Bantu languages of this area are not particularly, especially Kuvale, not so much is known. But actually what we tried first is to, using the historical comparative method, to make sort of a phylogeny or a tree of the Bantu languages. What we identify quite nicely is the Nyanneka and Gumbi cluster. Then we have Kuvale, which seems here to with the Nyanneka and Gumbi, but in other trees we had, it wasn't so clear. So probably this is actually goes back to the root, and we have Nyanneka and Gumbi, Kuvale, and Himba, Herero, and Wambo as sort of three clusters here that make up Shimbe Basia and Southwestern Angola. Within Kuvale, we find that Twa is an outlier. Now, somebody who says, the Twa, they must be a completely different Bantu, mysterious, non-Bantu population. No, they are not. Actually, they are an outlier here, because they are actually approaching the Himba and Herero in the Oluheke Desert, and they borrow a lot of words from Herero. That's why they are outlier from Kuvale, but it has nothing to do with non-Bantu influence. And also the Kwepe and the Kwisi. The Kwepe, as you remember, are the former Kwadi speakers, and their Kuvale falls completely within the Kuvale cluster. So we don't really find any lexical influence of Kwadi or any non-Bantu language on the Bantu languages of this area. They actually reproduce quite neatly roots that you can, for example, find in the Bantu Lexical Reconstructions database. One word, however, is always found in all Bantu languages of Southern Africa, and this is a root wu that comes out as onju or ondu in Southwestern Angola, and it means sheep. And if you look here at this map that I made of roots for sheep, you find that the root wu is only found in Southern Africa. And this makes it very likely that this is not a Bantu root, and that the Bantu, when they came to Southern Africa, they all borrowed a root for sheep, because it seems that sheep keeping was very associated with people speaking the language they borrowed wu from. And we assume that this is in fact the Khoe-Kwadi speakers. So in this root wu, we also find Inkuvale, Himba, Herero, Wambo, Nyaneka, Nkumi, and as you can see here in this cloud, in quite a lot of other Bantu languages, also in the east, even in areas where now no more Khoe-Kwadi is spoken. So the little triangles here would be Khoe-Kwadi. So you find that this is a word that also shows up in areas where no more Khoe-Kwadi is spoken, but probably Khoe-Kwadi was spoken in the past, or Bantu speakers diffused that root to other languages. There is a grammatical feature that is sometimes thought to be a Khoe-Kwadi feature in the languages of Southwestern Angola. I'm not super convinced, but I'm gonna show you the example anyway. So Bantu normally has a head initial compounds, meaning first comes the head, then the dependent. So like in Swahili, you say nyumba ndogo, house small, if you want to say a small house, or mwanamke mzee, woman old, if you want to say an old woman. Now, if you go to Kwadi, you see it's the other way around. Like male, if you want to say man, male person, you say koko. If you want to say cook person, you say cinco. If you want to say old shoes, you say Sao sapato de. So you see here, sapato is obviously a loan from Portuguese. So these are head final. Head final is the normal state of affairs in Khoe-Kwadi. Head initial is the normal state of affairs in Bantu. Now, if we go to Southwestern Angola, we find indeed that we have compounds that correspond to the Khoe-Kwadi state of affairs. Omu rumendu is actually male person. So it's the word order from Khoe-Kwadi. Or in Kuvale, Omukathiona, female child, or also from Ovambo, Omukainu, female person, Okulumuwoko, right side, Omukulumu, elder. So this is some examples of head final compounds in Southwest Bantu. It's not really clear how productive the strategy is. I would say it's not productive, because if you just elicit data, they produce perfectly Bantu head initial compounds. So I would say these are lexicalized expressions, but if these lexicalized expressions came to be under a contact influence from Khoe-Kwadi or from Kwadi proper, indeed, is up to debate. So this is what I have to say about Kwadi. It's unfortunately not so much, because we also have this problem that we don't have a lot of data from Kwadi. It's the data that Westphal collected, the data we collected from the rememberers, but there's no more data that can be had, so we are a bit stuck with what we have. But there's people working on figuring out more and better details. We are now going to move a little bit east, out of the Namibe desert into the wetlands of the Okavango River basin here, the Okavango Delta in Botswana. This is some pictures I took during fieldwork. This was in a very wet year. When we were there last year, it was much drier. This is where our current project is taking place. We follow the Okavango from Angola through a Namibian Caprivi strip into the Delta. And we have here many Khung speakers. We find them along the Okavango River in southeastern Angola, and then also in Botswana in the border area with Namibia. Then we have a Khoe-Kwadi speaking group. The Khoe-Kwadi in my schema always blue, so you can identify them better. We have here the Khwe, which is one of the biggest forager communities in Botswana. And actually their homeland, and probably the majority of them, was living in Angola, and most of them fled the war, also because they were aligned with the Portuguese and later with the South Africans, and then were for a short while persecuted, and then most of them escaped first to Namibia and some of them later to South Africa. Then a group I'm going to speak a bit more about, Tjerk already said this was my PhD research, and I'm still working with them, is the Kx'a community. It's a very small speech community of 200 people that live in a single village and speak a quite distinct language, which is actually great fun to work with because you have all speakers of that language in one place. And this is kind of a long-term project of mine. I've been working there now for 10 years and hopefully ongoing when the pandemic is over. And then we have here in the east the Kx'a speakers. It's people that live in an area that is characterized by great salt pans, but they haven't been foragers for quite a while. So most of these Kx'a speakers have either lost their language for the most part and don't remember having a foraging past. Then we have the Bantu speakers. We have here the Okavango along the Okavango River in Angola and Namibia. This is the Kwangali, the Giriku speakers, the Mbunza, the Shambiu, and the Hambukushu. And in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, we have the Yei, who live very closely entwined with the Khwe and the Kx'a. And they are a bit mysterious, but or are often considered mysterious, but they are probably an Eastern Bantu Botatwe speech community with West Bantu abstract and kind of strong poison borrowings. They really have a lot of clicks. The second case study about contact that I'm going to present is about the Kx'a. They live in this village of Mababe, and you see here, you saw pictures of Mababe before when it was very wet. Now it was very dry last year. No, 2 years ago, last year it rained more. I saw some pictures yesterday, so it's very green right now, and I'm relieved. And here's two speakers, Tsiamo and Splash, with whom part of the data that I'm going to present was also collected. So now I'm going to come a little bit to what I told you about the typological differences between Khwe and Kx'a and Tu. So Kx'a has some weird features that neighboring Khoe-Kwadi languages, here I use Khwe and Kx'a, don't necessarily have. And this concerns multiple domains in the language, the phonology. So they have pre-voiced uvula, something like Kx'a, which is not common in Khoe-Kwadi. We have had initial noun phrases. You will remember that Khoe-Kwadi is head final normally. So now that we saw a Bantu language go from head initial to head final, we are now seeing a Khoe-Kwadi language going from head final to head initial. Then we have here verbal modifiers requiring a relative construction. I'm going to show you what that is. We have relative clauses, possessives that are encoded as relative clauses, like something like the house that is my father's. And in the domain of participant marking, we have secundative alignment. I'm also going to show you what that is, an unmarked subject, verb, object. And you will remember that this is the word order of non-Khwe, but it is not the word order of Khoe-Kwadi. So we don't find these features. They are in Kx'a, but in Khwe we find them rarely, mostly in the Gani dialect, which is spoken in the neighborhood of Kx'a. So they are quite close geographically, and is completely absent in Kx'a in the Eastern Kalahari. However, all these features are found in Khung. So the first idea was, okay, probably there is some Khung influence, some Khung borrowing or substrate happening here. And I went through some historical records to find if there were any Khung in that area. And there is here a report from a geographer called Pasarge who says, it seems the Shikere live in the Mababe belt. Shikere is the Sekele, which is a term that also we know from Angola. It's usually used for Khung speakers of Angola. And he says here they live in the Mababe belt, which is the home of the Kx'a. but he also isn't sure. And then here's a comment by archaeologist Ed Wilmson, who says, this is the Sekele. They do not live in the Mababe belt, and Pasarge is probably cautious. Nevertheless, it may be that when Pasarge was there were actually Sekele in the Mababe belt. We cannot say that for sure. What we do find in that area is indeed place names that are not Kx'a and that are very, very, very clearly like An is the name of a hill that has rock art, and in Southern Africa, hills are often named after families like father, mother, child, or older brother, younger brother. Here it's the older brother. Then we have Khao, which is the river, the hippo pond, or Ngutsu, which seems to be a place where honey was eaten, or also places like Hudu, where people don't really actually know what the meaning of the place names was, for which I didn't find a translation, but there's still the possibility that indeed this comes from another language. We also find a bit of lexical borrowing in Kx'a from Khwe, not much. There is a lot of borrowing from Kx'a into Proto-Kalahari Khwe, the ancestral language shared between Kx'a and all the other Kalahari Khwe languages. But there's very few single borrowings or really individual borrowings between Kx'a and Khwe. However, these that are there seem to concern mostly cultural vocabulary here, like the basket or the calabash, the spoon, or things that appear in nature like grass, the camel thorn, and the grasshopper. But there's also verbs, like this very specific verb, find something that was lost by somebody else, or to slurp. Then we have this feature that I already told you, it's the voiced uvulars. This is something that Khwe doesn't have, and it's something like worm in Kx'a is ngai. The cognate form in Shua is gai, in Khwe is Khwe, and it seems here that in Jutwa, which is a Kx'a language, we have a different click, Kx'a, but it's clearly related, and it seems that these signs that I show, the glottal stop and the uvular sign that I made here, they mean this is creaky voice, and apparently this was here introduced as with this voiced uvular fricative, and there's multiple other examples for that. And what is interesting is that this sound, this voiced uvulars or prenasalized uvulars, were actually also introduced in roots where apparently in genuine Khoe-Kwadi roots, like here in Ngana and in Ngadi. So apparently this became a quite marked sound that also spread across the lexicon, was even introduced into genuine roots of the language. We also find some morphological borrowing, like the imperfective marker ko, like Tikopalanaishi. I regularly read. This is a marker that clearly comes from Khung, and is here mostly found in these southern dialects like Jutwa. And I gave you here some examples, but this is a quite obvious borrowing. Also, it doesn't exist in the neighboring Khoe-Kwadi languages. Then here, going back again to the head final compounds. So as I have shown you before with Kwadi, we first have the modifier, like the adjective or the demonstrative, and then the head, like Tafra, the big table, or Gobe, the big cow, Gudi Keri, the difficulties of this country, and Ngungu, this house. Now in Kx'a, the thing is actually more complicated. Here is how Kx'a expresses the relative clause. Usually you have the head, like here the dress, then you have the relative marker, or what I here call the attributor, because it's used in so many contexts where there's no relative clause. And they say kind of kuka as a ashina, the dress that you have put on. So here is the gender number marker that actually belongs to the dress, is the ma, and ka is the relative marker. And funnily, this ka also shows up with adjective and demonstratives, like hakamka korashi, the toad that is big, the big toad, or eka mukurum, the that mokoro. Then this also works with numerals. Goben guaka, the three of the children, or the children which are three. And Sedi Aruka, this is really complicated. Ours as the game which is ours. This is basically what they say. And this is clearly a Hu or Ju pattern. They also use this relative marker, which here is a in Jusa Mikwa, the people I'm looking for. This relative marker also shows up with demonstratives in Jua He, in adjectives, Awa, and with quantifiers and with possessives. So pretty much in the same context where we find it in Kx'a, it also shows up in Kx'a. And the reason is that non-Khwe has what we call a verbal modifier. So modifiers like demonstratives, adjectives, and so on are actually verbs, and they need to be treated as verbs, and hence need a relative construction. And what Kx'a here does, they kind of do something like a pattern modification. They copy that pattern with their own morphological material. And we have a similar pattern borrowing in the constituent order. So what we find here, I did this a bit superficially. I looked at word order of transitive clauses in text, narrative, and elicitation. And what we find here is that SOV, which is the traditional word order for Khoe-Kwadi, and SVO appear almost in the same frequency, and indeed are in some contexts in free variation. And I would also speculate that this may indeed be contact influence from Kx'a, which has SVO clauses, though we also have to be aware that Bantu too is an SVO language, though it is structurally so different that I would say the better source is here indeed non-Khwe with the Kx'a languages. Then I've spoken about ditransitive construction. So there's a thing here that a lot of languages have ditransitives in the sense of kitile, which means that the direct and the indirect object are treated exactly the same. And this happens here in Khwe, for example, where the fire and that fire and him are treated in the same way. Also here in Khwe, or the theme can be, in the next sentence too, they are both marked with an accusative marker, and the same is true for Shua. So the recipient and the theme are treated the same. They don't receive different case marking. This is very different in Kx'a. Here the recipient receives the accusative marker, so it is treated as the direct object of a transitive clause, and the theme receives the oblique marker Ka, which is not identical with the relative marker that I showed you before. There's in fact 3 different Kas in Kx'a, which is quite confusing. So we will give you food. Kx'a, this is the recipient who gets the accusative marker, and no Ka, the food, the theme is marked as oblique, and the same, she was telling us a story. Kx'a, us, the recipients, we receive the accusative marker, and Munainika, the story, receives the oblique. This is exactly the same what we find in Khung. Again, it's a pattern borrowing. It is not really a borrowing of the morphology. Here, for example, in Jutra, the particle Ko, which appears here before the theme, is used to mark the theme as oblique. And in Northwestern Khung, the particle Ke is used to mark the theme as oblique. So this is the same pattern. Theme is marked as oblique. The recipient is marked like the object of a transitive clause. So again, a case of pattern borrowing. And here we go back to this list of the typological features of as I promised you. We find here in Kx'a some of them. The SVO word order, we don't have transitive verbs, we have the secundative alignment, and there is here also 2 that I didn't speak about, but that appear in Kx'a is serial verb constructions and multipurpose oblique marking. So I think what we can say is that Kx'a is a language that has probably been quite heavily influenced by Kx'a language, and I think it matches quite well what Sally Thomason has suggested about interference through shift. She says, okay, if you want to say that one language was influenced by another group of speakers shifting to that language, you have to prove the existence of contact. I think that we have done that through the place names. There is diverse shared features in both languages. Yes, we have phonology, morphology, mostly syntax. we have shown that the shared features exist in Khwe because they exist across multiple dialects of Khwe. We have also shown that these features normally don't exist in Khoe-Kwadi and also not in the surrounding Khoe-Kwadi languages. The model that I propose would be that a small number of people that were speaking the ancestor of Kx'a, pre-Kx'a, moved into that area, and there was a group of Khwe speakers. And since they are no longer there, it can be assumed that maybe either they went away and part of them, that state, might have shifted to Kx'a. And since there were many, they probably introduced in their version of Kx'a quite a lot of substrate mistakes or learners' mistakes. And because there were many, probably at some point they outnumbered the speakers of regular Kx'a, and that created modern Kx'a, which is a Khoe-Kwadi language with a quite heavy Kx'a substrate. But is this really the end? It's not. I'm gonna skip this because I want to speak a bit more about genetics in the end. But what I can tell you is, and that you can see from these tables, that Kx'a has also borrowed from Bantu, which is mostly lexicon, mostly nouns, few verbs, and some function words, like here. So what happened is probably after this Kx'a substrate had been introduced in Kx'a, the Kx'a borrowed from Bantu languages of the area and introduced some Bantu lexicon. So this is what the language looks like now. It has elements of all the population strata of pre-colonial Southern Africa exist in that one tiny language spoken by 200 people, and I find it really quite beautiful. So we have talked about linguistic admixture, and I think I can still spend talking a bit about genetic admixture. I will go a bit slow here because probably you're not so used to seeing these kinds of display. This is research that was mostly carried out by our MA student, Beatriz Amorim. You can see her here, and Sandra Oliveira, who's now a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. So what Beatrice did here, she plotted the family tree, the linguistic tree of Khoe-Kwadi on a map. This can be done with Bayesian methods. I'm not going to go so much into this, but what we see here nicely is we see the Kwadi, they are herders. We see the Khwe in the south that are no longer there, but we used historical data here that were also herders. And the Kalahari Khwe, all of them are foragers. That's why I put the bow and arrow. And here's again for you to see the areas that we looked at. We looked at the Kwadi in Southwestern Angola, and we looked at the Kx'a and a bit the Khwe in the Okavango River Basin. So in the south here, we find the two. This is people that Khoe-Kwadi would have encountered as they moved south. And what you see here in the right side is a principal component analysis. So this is kind of individuals. The individuals are colored by language, and they are plotted here in this square. And basically, individuals that are close to each other are genetically close. So they are more closely related than people that are far away from each other. So the people that are in this corner where I put you here too, you see this blue squares, and there's also some green people. This is mostly two speakers. They are the Southern Khoisan. Then here in the north, we have Kx'a, mostly speakers of Zhu or Khwe. They appear here also very close to each other in this plot here, where I put you Zhu Kx'a. And then here, these yellow guys in this plot are the Bantu speakers. So basically we have the first axis, the x-axis, separates the Bantu speakers from the Khoisan, who are the Kx'a and the Tu in this plot. And the second axis separates the northern Khoisan, who speak Kx'a, from the southern Khoisan, who mostly speak Tu. There is one Kx'a speaking group among them, that's why, but I didn't really put them here not to complicate things. And you may wonder, but where are the Khoe-Kwadi in this plot? The Khoe-Kwadi are here. They fall between all these groups. So I've shown you that there's this beautiful linguistic admixture in the Khoe-Kwadi, and this seems to be a bit mirrored in their genes. So they don't form their own pole. They are just really all over. Some are closer to the Bantu, some are closer or almost identical with the Tu, and some are very close to the Kx'a. So how did this happen? This is something that our project is concerned with. I have already shown what happened linguistically, and you will now see that something very, very, very similar happened in the genes of those people, probably. So we have here a scenario where I took here the Khwe as an example, and the Khwe, because we have genetic data from the Khwe, we don't have genetic data from the Kx'a. I would like to show you genetic data from Kx'a, but the pandemic unfortunately put a stop to our planned fieldwork, so next time. But the model we devised is that a small group of Khoe-Kwadi speakers, or of pre-Khwe speakers, got in contact with Khung. And since the Khwe are few, but the Khung are many, and the Khwe men that probably still have livestock at that point, so they marry a lot of Khung women. And each generation they introduce a lot of people that are genetically Khung. And since they are so few, and since there are no Khoe-Kwadi people coming from East Africa anymore, they arrive and that's it. It doesn't take long until the Khwe have become genetically almost like the Khung. And the Khung have become a bit like the Khwe because probably some Khwe men have also fathered Khung children. So now when the Bantu enter this picture, something else happens. It seems that a lot of Bantu genes were introduced into the Khwe. And this is true for all Khoe-Kwadi speakers of the Northern Kalahari Basin fringe. We saw that we only had a bit of lexical borrowing. And this is maybe not what you would expect, that in fact, we find a lot of genetic material from the Bantu in the Khwe. And this is also not just men that father children, but otherwise left. We actually find maternal DNA in the Khwe. So there seems to have been a scenario there in the north where actually Bantu speakers shifted to Khoe-Kwadi languages and seemed for the most part to have adopted the language. It could be that the click loss, I talked about that in the context of Kwadi, might have been introduced by Bantu women who entered the communities, but didn't learn all the clicks and so introduced the phonetic simplification, much like Khoisan women introduced clicks in Nguni, but just the other way around. But this is just a hypothesis and something we are currently working on. So this is here the actual data where always the blue part is the East African. This is very, very, very low. So this East African component, we still find it in the Khwe, in the Khoe-Kwadi speakers, but it's so low it doesn't make an effect if we plot them. We always find a lot of South Africa, which is the Khoisan, the Kx'a and the Tu that appears in red, and a lot of Bantu, which is West Africa here in green. Just for you to have a comparison, I'll show you here some groups. So the Kwadi, they have very little East African. They are mostly Bantu. And they have a tiny little bit of Kx'a or Tu as well. Here, this red component. We have the Khwe that are a little bit more East African and also more Khoisan in the sense that their red component is bigger, but they're also very Bantu. But now if we go to the central Kalahari, to a group called Gui, and I told you before, this is the stereotypical Khoisan, the ones from the gods must be crazy, and that you look at and think, this is the Khoisan, this is the Bushman. These Khoe-Kwadi speakers are almost identical with the non-Khwe. So they have mostly red, which is the forager component from South Africa. They have barely admixed with the Bantu, which is also reflected in their language. I didn't show you that, but they have very little Bantu borrowings. And they also just retain a little bit, about 6% of Eastern African ancestry. Then the Khwe, the Nama from the Southern Kalahari, the herders, they are also very, very Khoisan. They have a little bit of Bantu and they retain almost 20% of Eastern African ancestry. So they actually are the best retainers of the Khoe-Kwadi profile because they speak the language. They have a lot of East African genetic ancestry and they are also herders. To provide you with some conclusions, I've shown you languages and ethnic groups of Southern Angola and the Okavango River Basin, and they show traces of the very same contact patterns between the three big groups, the indigenous foragers, the Khoe-Kwadi and the Bantu, and they show contact patterns that characterize the whole area. So this is really nice because we don't have to go to the central Kalahari to see these contact patterns. The very same waves also affected the Northern Kalahari Basin fringe. We have seen that language can be characterized as both substrate interference, which is what happened in Kx'a, where we saw that probably speakers of Khwe shifted to Khoe-Kwadi, but also borrowing, which is a lot the lexical borrowing of Bantu terms that we see in both Kwadi and also in Kx'a and in many other languages. And we can probably say that the major social linguistic triggers for the contact influence that we see there is a dominance relation. So probably first the Khoe-Kwadi, who may have had for some time livestock, they were dominant over the Kx'a and Tu, or at least Kx'a and Tu wanted the livestock, and it was attractive for them to shift language. And for sure, there's a prestige relation between Bantu languages, which are the languages of education, especially in Botswana and South Africa, and Khoe-Kwadi languages. And finally, the Bantu influence, both linguistically and genetically, is certainly bigger in the northern fringe than in the central and the southwestern Kalahari. And I always thought, I think researchers often think that this is something that makes these people boring or diluted or no longer pure. And I think exactly the contrary. It's really so exciting to see all these groups interacting and how they contributed to creating these groups that we see now. I think in some cases, like in the Khwe, we can truly speak of ethnogenesis. And I think this is indeed very exciting. So just some insights. Thank you very much, obrigada. And I hope you could take something with you from this talk.
Thank you so much, Fehn. That was most interesting. I hope we have some questions now. We have a few minutes for questions and any comments. Please feel free. If you want to, se quiserem, podem, se houver, imagino que não haja muitas perguntas, porque o tema é muito difícil para nós. E sentimos-nos ignorantes, mas talvez as pessoas que trabalham com a linguística africana tenham algumas questões ou alguns comentários.
Can I ask a question? Yes. Yeah, can you hear me? I had some difficulties. Yes. Actually, I was kicked off and then came back on. I was going to ask about click loss, because you talked about click loss at some point, and I was wondering why would the Nguni languages in South Africa, why would they borrow clicks? So if you say that there is a tendency for click loss, what explains the fact that the Nguni languages, the Bantu languages, have borrowed quite some? What does it mean in terms of social relations between the groups, and why would they retain, or why would they borrow clicks from these languages?
This is
not sure if you.
Very exciting question that is a bit unresolved, because there has been this hypothesis put forward that was via Hlonipa. Hlonipa is a social lecture, social register in Southern Bantu, where syllables in the names of the parents-in-law are avoided. So, for example, if your mother-in-law is called Anna, it's better that every time the syllable an appears in her presence, you don't say an, you should say something slightly modified like gan. So for example, if you say anger, you say then ganger. And there has been this proposal that Bantu men married Khoisan women, and the Khoisan women used their click inventory creatively in Hlonipa, and this would have arguably spread through the language. I don't find this very convincing. I think most Khoisanists actually don't. It's something that's very much repeated in the social linguistics literature. I think a better guess is that the Southern Bantu languages, especially in Nguni, they have a lot of ideophones. Ideophones include onomatopoeia. It's the sound class of word class that imitates sounds. And this is quite common in Southern Bantu. And in fact, if you go through the lexicon of the Click lexicon in Nguni, you find that a lot of words are actually related to ideophonic things like to drip or to chop, which then comes out like an. So it's not clear whether they might not, as they came in contact with Click speakers and obviously intermarried with Click speakers. You can see that in their genes that they in part intermarried quite heavily with Khoisan, but it was just women that they introduced. It could be that when they came into contact with this, they saw this the clicks as a repertoire to form more ideophones, which is something that is very, very prevalent in these languages and apparently not so frequent in Western Bantu. So I guess this is also less researched. It has also been proposed that that these clicks became a socio-linguistic marker, that there were mixed groups formed of Khoe-Kwadi, probably Khoe-Kwadi Bantu speakers, and that they wanted to mark their identity by using clicks. Which also seems to be a bit of a shaky hypothesis. Maybe it's a mixture of all of the above. There were maybe things in Southeastern and Nguni culture that were very susceptible to the adoption of clicks. And this could be a combination of clonipa, social markedness, and ideophone production. I'm sorry, I couldn't give you a better answer, but this is probably the most common theories about that.
Okay.
Okay. May I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. Great talk. I have two questions. The first one is whether there is any work on phonology beyond segmental phonology for these languages.
Yes.
So
yeah, so they are all tone languages. You may have seen, at least in my Kx'a data, that there is a tone marking.
Yeah.
So the tone bearing unit is the mora, not the syllable, and you basically you can reconstruct everything back to a high and a low tone. And due to certain depressor effects, you get up to 4 tones in the modern languages. Like Kx'a has 3 tones, Nama has 4 tones. Khung is sometimes analyzed with 3, sometimes with 4 tones. And this is an interaction also of phonation type, because you have these major phonation types in the area. You have everywhere nasal and oral, that is also in Khoe-Kwadi. And in non-Khwe, you have also uvular, breathy, and creaky voice. And you have seen a bit that the Kx'a, they tried somehow to integrate the uvular, the pharyngeal phonation, by throwing it on a consonant base, basically. But there is some ideophones where the Kx'a use creaky voice, for example, in Uara, which is, I cannot do it very well, which is a crow. So in ideophones, they also, which again shows a bit the role of ideophones, they tend to borrow phonation. And there is a phonotactic template for the Kalahari Basin, which Hiroshi Nakagawa, Tony Trail, and Tom Guldemann worked on, which has to do with syllable structures and which consonants are allowed in which place. So there is quite a lot of research on that. And there has been for a while the assumption that actually Khoe-Kwadi borrowed the whole phonotactic template of non-Khwe, of Kx'a and Tu, because it's so similar. And there was always this assumption that Kwadi from Angola would be very different and not follow this template. But actually the data we have suggests that already Kwadi follows this template quite well. So either Khoe-Kwadi followed this phonotactic template before it entered the Kalahari Basin, and this template was something that existed in a bigger area, or the phonotactic influence on the language family happened before Kwadi split off from the rest. So that is the two theories about it.
Yeah, but is there anything on phrasal phonology, for example? So how words are phrased and from the phonological point of view?
Yes, I think that Willy Hake has done some work on Nama.
Okay.
There's a book on Nama tonology from where he also talks about post-segmental tonology, and it goes a bit into that. There is some works on stress, though I would say these works on stress are misguided interpretations of depressor effects. But if you're interested, I can send you at least a work by Hake or Nama if you're interested in that.
Yeah, and the other question is related to this actually, because you have presented a number of linguistic features, right, in your analysis of the relations or connections between all these languages. And then you presented the genetic data, right, and the parallels between the two sets of data. So the question would be, I don't know anything about genetics at all. So the question would be, do you think that there are certain linguistic features or domains that mirror better the genetic data than other linguistic features or other linguistic domains?
This is a very interesting question, actually. This is a jackpot question. I like that question. I would say that probably what you would associate with substrate interference, in the sense that it is influence from a shifting community, that would also introduce new genetic material into the community. If we go back to the that shifted to Kx'a, though we don't have genetic data from Kx'a, it's almost true. We find a lot of genetic material there. And usually when you talk about shift, usually the assumption is that you would introduce more structural features, like what we have seen a little bit, the word order. We would find more pattern borrowing than matter borrowing. So we find kind of these pattern borrowings where they borrow the structure of encoding the indirect object, how they encode, how they turn nominal modification into relative constructions. So I would say, if you have a situation where a lot of genetic material is introduced from one group into another, that also means that one group might have shifted language from one group to another. And so I would say that you would see more of this in the structural features. But now comes the thing here that we find really a lot of Bantu Bantu genes in these northern Kalahari languages. And the only thing we find there in the languages is actually lexical borrowing, even in the Kwadi, who are genetically almost fully Bantu. I wasn't, of course, there is very little data, but I wouldn't say there was a huge ton of syntactic or structural influence from Bantu and Kwadi. What we find is the lexicon. So that would contradict that a bit. But I would tend to say in general, and probably also if I don't know if Tjerk agrees or disagrees, coming from the Creole studies with the substrate, that would obviously also support this, because most Creole speakers are genetically similar to the speakers of their substrate languages.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the nice questions.
Any more questions? Any comments?
Yes, if nobody else asks, let me ask. Thank you very much for this very impressive presentation. I first have to apologize that I came late because I had a confusion of time, and I also spent the whole morning, afternoon at the DGFS already. Yeah, so my question concerns the syntax. So you mentioned at some point serial verbs, I guess from Khoisan. I would be interested maybe if you could again show what influence, what role they play in this language context situation, and maybe give some examples of what serial verbs there are involved, what classes of.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. I was trying to circumnavigate a little bit the serial verbs, because you have real serial verb constructions in Kx'a and Tu. They are very inherent feature of the Khoisan Sprachbund, minus the Khoe-Kwadi. Now the Khoe-Kwadi make extensive use of multiverbal predicates. And these have sometimes been interpreted as serial verb constructions. But they include a linking element which is semantically opaque, the juncture morpheme. If you want, I can send you some literature on that. So the big ongoing debate we have in Southern African Khoisan studies is what is a serial verb construction, which is obviously a big ongoing debate in linguistics as such, I suppose. So yeah, but we have even switch function where the subject object switch between the two verbs. Kx'a has something that is, I think, a big non-Khwe feature is if you have multiple verbs in multiple predicates in a clause, they are kind of just all put one after the other. So sometimes it's you need like a ruler to try to figure out what belongs where. But this is a big tendency that if there are verbs, they like to agglomerate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sorry.
I can send you some literature if you're interested. Okay, please. I think I can. Probably you can get my email address. I will be very happy to share some materials if you're interested in that.
Sorry, may I ask something?
Yes, of course. You come from the KBA, right? I have seen your name before.
Yes. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. And my question is, I believe it's quite simple and it's not as interesting as the previous question, so I'm sorry for this. But I'm very interested in the part of your work that goes on reconstruction. I saw that you presented some proto-forms, some proto-clicks, if I remember right. And I may have lost some piece of information, but I was interested in knowing how do you reconstruct it? If you only look at synchronic data, since I believe you don't have historical data on this
Yes,
topic.
we only look at synchronic data, but there is a major work which I can share of Rainer Vossen on the Khwe languages. It's the major work on the historical comparative reconstruction of Khwe, which is the family that constitutes Kalahari, Khwe, and Khwe minus Kwadi. So the Kwadi link is later. So basically, what my assumption was is that if there is a click in Khwe, I assume there will also be a click in Proto-Khoe-Kwadi, even if Kwadi has lost the click. And there is some reason not to assume click genesis. One is that actually we cannot show in the Kalahari Basin any case of click genesis historically. So clicks are easier lost than gained, if you want. And also the click loss patterns we have in Kwadi are not so different from click loss patterns that we have in other languages. So Kwadi is not the only Khoe-Kwadi language that loses clicks. There's many. Kx'a loses some clicks, especially in the core lexicon. We even have click loss in Khung, especially in Angola. So if you have a root Khung, which is a lateral click, and it means tooth, and then you have people that say Khung, this is that Kh'u would be the natural replacement of the lateral click because the lateral place of articulation is retained. So there is some cases of click loss where the place of articulation is not retained. They are more tricky. I can send you a paper on that. There's some speculation, but fact is that mostly the place of articulation is retained. And sometimes, like in Kwadi, you have some sort of spirantization where the stop produced in the place of articulation of the click becomes a fricative. Why that happens is maybe something we will never be able to answer. May even have to do with the patterns of Bantu spirantization that then operated on genuine Kwadi terms, because there's some hints this may have happened.
Okay.
I don't know if this answers your question, but normally we don't assume click genesis.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. This was a good question, by the way.
Yeah, can I ask one more question? It's more about the state of the art and my curiosity related to the Tanzanian click languages, especially Sandawe, of course. Is there any news on the possible connection between Sandawe and the Khoe-Kwadi branch, or
yeah, I heard that
is this something that has?
I mean, the cheerleader of that is obviously my dear colleague at Elderkin, who has done research on both Khoe-Kwadi and Sandawe. The problem here is that it's really difficult to find forms where you can convincingly show that they are cognate between Khoe-Kwadi and Sandawe. Because coming back to the question about phonotactics, the phonotactic template of Sandawe in East Africa is quite different from Khoe-Kwadi. For example, you can have root medial clicks in Sandawe, which can never happen in Southern Africa, and Khoe-Kwadi nowhere else. I found some cognate forms. I think a lot of them have been published elsewhere. Structurally, it's difficult. Sometimes I have days where I look at Sandawe data and think this looks like Khoe-Kwadi, and then I have days where I look at it and think, oh, doesn't resemble at all. But in any case, it's very difficult. I think that the problem here is that we have very little surface material to go by in terms of reconstruction. Probably one would have to go for an approach like they are now trying with some projects on typology, with big scale mapping of typological features, and see if we would something cluster of Khoe-Kwadi and Sandawe against everything else. But I would say with conservative methods, it's very difficult.
I imagine typology is also very complicated because of the heavy context situations in which each of these languages is involved. But
yeah, maybe, especially Sandawe. Sandawe has lots of Bantu borrowings actually, right. So it's quite tricky.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the nice talk. I forgot to say that.
Yeah, thank you very much for making it possible. It was really nice talk, nice questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
We still have a question. Maria João has some comments on your talk.
Thank you, Anna-Marie. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I just have a question following Kx'a's question on the click loss patterns. Do you have any idea on this path, whether place of articulation plays a role in this loss? Do we tend to preserve posterior or anterior place of articulation, or there's no pattern that you've been observing in this loss of clicks?
This is an interesting question, because if you have accompaniments, I think the posterior place of articulation is usually retained. For example, if you have, this is tricky. If you have an alveolar click with a uvular or alveolar fricative accompaniment, something like Kx'a, what you would expect if both anterior and posterior are retained is something like Kx'a, but this almost never happens. You get Kx'a. So this is tricky. This would be a question for my colleague Bonnie Sands, who's actually a phonetician, and she's much better at these things than me. But sometimes it's in fact unexpected, and sometimes you have indeed a variation. And there is now some discussion if you even have differences between different Khoisan languages, because there is an ongoing debate whether clicks plus accompaniment are actually complex sounds, or if they are clusters. So obviously this has a big influence on what you're asking, because if they are clusters, the likelihood to retain the posterior place of articulation would be much higher, probably. Or to retain the cluster, in fact, to retain both. And there are some languages where that happens. So there's a debate whether you can really have a unified model of click systems to say they are all clusters or they are all complex sounds, or if there is in fact differences between languages. This is an ongoing topic. I'm involved in a project, but it's not, unfortunately, not my specialization.
Thank you very much.
If there is no more questions, I would like to
I have
thank
one.
you again. You have one? Please do.
Actually, like Portuguese and German are very good cases in point for genesis of clusters, of consonant clusters. I saw that there are also many clusters in the languages you were investigating. Do you have any idea of how they came about? Whether there's something like loss of vowels in between, or how does it come that there are so many consonants in the onset?
In the onset, I think it's not vowel loss. So this is again, is this in fact clusters? This would be the one approach. There's other approaches that where the assumption is that each root has a basic phonation, and this phonation can be oral, nasal, pharyngeal, or breathy. And there is some approaches that suggest that the onset, the cluster onsets, or the clustering in the onset is in some way connected to the phonation of the root. For example, that that you would get something like uvular friction as a result of a general uvular or pharyngeal phonation in the root. There is some approaches. The work by Ed Elderkin focuses mostly on that. So if you want if you're interested in that, I can send you that as well. It's again something where I myself am a bit clumsy, but I know that this is something he's majorly working on.
Yeah, please.
I'll send you a contact if you want, Jacob.
Zeker.
Okay?
Zeker.
Okay. Okay. Now, well, thank you again, and it was most, I don't know, I feel a bit stupid, but I enjoyed it very much. I learned a lot, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. Obrigada a todos, até à próxima, que será daqui a um mês, com mais um seminário surpresa.
Obrigada para todos. A próxima.
Obrigada, Anne. Obrigada a todos.
Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.